On one side, they are the undisputed emperors of soul, wearing glittering suits and healing a divided America with anthems of universal love. On the other side, their legacy is a staggering graveyard, a founding member brutally murdered and left to rot in a frozen ravine, bodies broken by relentless industry pressure, and a second generation destroyed by lethal drug addictions. The world danced to their rhythm, while record labels built multi-million-dollar empires off their vocal cords. They were the OJs. So, how did the architects of the Philadelphia soul sound become the ultimate casualties of a corporate machine that systematically stripped them of their money, their identity, and ultimately their lives? The mechanics of this tragedy shatter the romanticized version of the music industry. The issue is not merely that these artists were underpaid. The issue is how the system was legally and structurally designed to ensure they could never own themselves. The public saw the gold records, the television appearances, and the sold-out arenas. They assumed wealth equated to freedom. But behind the velvet ropes of the 1970s recording industry lay a labyrinth of financial capture, a system built to extract maximum capital from raw human talent while shielding the architects of that system from any physical or emotional toll. The artists were not viewed as partners in a creative endeavor. They were viewed as high-yield, expendable commodities, operating within a sophisticated mechanism of indentured servitude. The fatal weakness of these artists, their hamartia, was not greed, but a desperate, consuming hunger for the stage. Originating from the working-class neighborhoods of Canton, Ohio, the founding members of the group possessed an extraordinary, raw gospel talent. For young black men in America during the mid-20th century, the avenues for escaping economic gravity were brutally narrow. Music was not just an art form, it was a perceived lifeline. The industry executives understood this psychological desperation perfectly. When a young, impoverished singer is offered the chance to perform under the brightest lights, to hear their voice broadcast across the nation, they do not ask for independent legal counsel. They do not scrutinize the small print regarding mechanical royalties or publishing rights. They simply sign the paper, believing that their talent will be enough to protect them. This burning desire to be heard was immediately weaponized against them, locking them into contracts that would dictate the rest of their lives and the lives of their children. Once the ink was dry, the artists were fed into the financial engine of the era, the recoupment system. Many music historians and legal analysts argue that standard recording contracts of this period were among the most exploitative legal documents in modern entertainment. Under the recoupment model, the record label functioned more like a predatory lending institution than a creative partner. Every single expense associated with the creation and promotion of the music was classified as a high-interest loan pushed squarely onto the artist's ledger. The studio time, the session musicians, the orchestral arrangements that defined the lush Philly soul sound, the promotional photographs, the radio marketing, and even the glittering stage suits, all of it was billed back to the singers. The artists were effectively financing their own exploitation. The mathematics of this system were chillingly precise. If an album cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to produce and market, the artist would not see a single penny of royalty income until that entire debt was cleared from their percentage of the sales, which was notoriously kept in the single digits. Meanwhile, the label collected the lion's share of the gross revenue from the very first record sold. The corporate entities were generating massive, immediate profits, while the men whose faces were on the album covers were perpetually swimming against a tide of manufactured debt. Furthermore, the industry utilized a mechanism known as cross-collateralization. If one album failed to recoup its costs, that negative balance was carried forward to the next album. An artist could achieve a platinum-selling chart-topping record and still receive a royalty check for $0 because they were paying off the manufactured deficit of a previous project. They were trapped in a perpetual cycle of labor, forced to constantly record and tour simply to break even with their corporate masters. However, the financial starvation was only the first layer of control. The industry did not just own their money, it demanded total ownership of their cultural identity. The masters, the original definitive sound recordings, were strictly the property of the label. The artists had no legal claim to the physical manifestation of their own voices. They could not dictate where their music was licensed, how it was used in television or film, or how it was repackaged for future generations. They were sharecroppers on the estate of their own vocal cords. The men singing the songs held no equity in the empires they were building. Beyond the boardroom, this control extended directly to the public airwaves through a rigid system of gatekeeping. During this era, talent was utterly irrelevant if you were not permitted to appear. The landscape of public consumption was fiercely guarded by radio program directors, television bookers, and chart executives. For black artists, their commercial valuation was entirely dependent on their ability to be packaged for a mainstream, predominantly white demographic. This required a relentless process of cultural filtering, known as the crossover pressure. The industry executives recognized the raw, emotive power of the group's gospel roots, but they deemed it too rough, too authentic, and too black for mass commercial consumption. The gatekeepers demanded a sanitized, digestible product. The deep guttural cries of pain and the complex syncopated rhythms of their original sound were systematically smoothed out, heavily orchestrated with lush strings and polished brass to make the music safe for middle-class audiences. But the crossover pressure was not limited to the audio tracks. It dictated every aspect of their physical existence. The artists were subjected to intense image management. Their wardrobes were heavily curated to project non-threatening sophistication. Their choreography was drilled to absolute uniform perfection, removing any spontaneity or aggressive physical expression. In interviews, they were strictly forbidden from addressing the volatile political and social realities of the era, forced instead to maintain a perpetual vacant smile and speak only of universal love and dancing. This psychological manipulation took a devastating toll. The gap between how the public perceived them and their inner reality became a chasm of silent suffering. They were forced to inhabit an artificial persona, a polished avatar created by a corporate board. Every night they stepped onto the stage to sing Love Train, projecting joy and unity, while internally grappling with the humiliating knowledge that they were heavily indebted to the very men who controlled their schedules. They were celebrated as kings by the audience, but treated as disposable assets by their management. The psychological weight of suppressing one's authentic cultural voice, of knowing that your true self is considered unmarketable and must be hidden, is a quiet, daily violence. It breeds a profound sense of alienation, turning the very act of performing into an exercise in self-betrayal. The management tactics used to enforce this compliance were equally brutal. When artists began to question the financial structures or push back against the creative restrictions, the machine did not offer negotiation. It deployed the strategy of divide and conquer. The goal was to end sure, the artists never formed a united front. Handlers and executives frequently instigated suspicion among the group members. They would offer subtle, unequal perks, whisper conflicting information about royalty distributions, and manufacture internal friction to keep the artists isolated and distrustful of one another. The group was not defeated by external competition. They were meticulously dismantled from within by the very people employed to guide their careers. The industry understood that a fractured group of indebted men is far easier to control than a unified collective demanding transparency. This relentless pressure cooker of debt, censorship, and psychological manipulation set the stage for the physical catastrophes that were to follow. The artists were not allowed to rest because resting meant the debt would accumulate, and the gatekeepers would quickly find another group to fill their slot on the radio. The concept of taking a hiatus for mental or physical health was entirely alien to the contracts they had signed. The machine required constant motion. The tour bus had to keep driving. The stage lights had to keep turning on. If the mind broke under the pressure, the industry ignored it. But when the physical bodies of the artists finally began to buckle under the strain of this relentless exploitation, the true cold-blooded nature of the recording industry was laid bare. They had sold their souls for the spotlight, driven by that desperate, fatal desire to be heard. But the machine was no longer satisfied with just their souls, their publishing rights, and their cultural identity. As the demands of the recoupment ledgers grew heavier, the industry began to demand their physical bodies. The gears of the Philadelphia soul machine were turning faster, and when a human being could no longer keep pace with the RPM of a spinning vinyl record, the system did not offer a safety net. It simply prepared the disposal mechanisms. The first casualty of this process would not occur under the bright lights of a sold-out arena, but in the freezing shadows of an Ohio winter, where the industry would demonstrate exactly how it handles a piece of machinery that is no longer profitable. The freezing wind of February 1982 swept across the industrial landscape of Twinsburg, Ohio, carrying with it the bitter chill of a Rust Belt winter. Behind a machine shop partially obscured by the relentless snow and the gray skeletal branches of the surrounding woods lay a black garbage bag. It was a mundane object in a desolate place, easily ignored by anyone passing by. But when workers finally tore open the plastic, they did not find refuse. They found human bones. The remains were heavily decomposed, stripped of flesh and identity by the passage of time and the harsh elements. Forensic anthropologists later examined the fractured remnants of this human life and determined a gruesome sequence of events. The victim had not simply died. He had been violently discarded. The skull showed clear signs of severe blunt force trauma. The bones bore the unmistakable marks of vicious repeated stab wounds. Whoever did this wanted to ensure the victim was not just dead, but eradicated. They stuffed him into a bag like industrial waste and left him to rot in a frozen ravine. At that exact moment, in 1982, radios across America were spinning the flawlessly orchestrated multi-platinum hits of the OJs. The airwaves were saturated with their message of love, unity, and rhythmic perfection. Record executives were cashing massive royalty checks, and the group was firmly established as royalty in the realm of Philadelphia soul. What neither the executives nor the millions of adoring fans, nor perhaps even the remaining band members knew, was that the fractured bones resting in that Ohio evidence locker belonged to the man who helped build the very foundation of that empire. His name was Frank Little Jr. He was an original guitarist, a foundational vocale, and a primary architect of the group's early rhythm and blues sound. Yet, the industry that built castles on his musical bedrock had allowed him to become a nameless, forgotten corpse. The absolute ruthlessness of this corporate amnesia traces back to the early 1960s, long before the tailored suits and the sanitized crossover hits. Before they were the polished emperors of Philly soul, they were a raw, hungry vocal group from Canton, Ohio, originally known as the Mascots. Frank Little was there in the trenches. He provided the gritty, authentic guitar work and the essential vocal harmonies that gave the group its initial street-level credibility. He was not a hired session player. He was a founding member. He poured his creative lifeblood into their early recordings, helping to establish the sonic blueprint that would later be commercialized for mass consumption. He was a crucial part of the engine that got the vehicle moving. However, the music industry is fundamentally intolerant of anything it cannot easily package and control. As the 1960s progressed, the group began its transition toward a more mainstream, commercially viable sound. The demands of the gatekeepers shifted. The industry required a tighter, more uniform aesthetic, one that often meant shedding the rougher, less manageable elements of a band's original lineup. Historical accounts suggest that Frank Little departed the group around 1965, just as they were inching closer to the precipice of global fame. Whether he walked away due to creative differences, the crushing weight of the lifestyle, or was quietly pushed out to make the group more palatable for the impending crossover market, the result was the same. He was separated from the protective, albeit exploitative, bubble of the group. When an artist loses the backing of the corporate music machine, the fall is not a gradual descent. It is a violent drop into the abyss. Frank Little went from standing on the verge of musical immortality to completely vanishing into the unforgiving streets of Ohio. He served in the United States Army, he lived his life in Cleveland, and then he simply disappeared. The vulnerability of a former musician stripped of his platform and severed from his peers is profound. He was a man who possessed immense talent, but lacked the ruthless corporate machinery required to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. And when the world finally swallowed him whole, ending his life in a flurry of unimaginable violence, the silence that followed was deafening. This is where the true systemic cruelty of the entertainment business reveals itself. The issue is not just that Frank Little was murdered. Tragedies occur in every sector of society. The issue is the absolute terrifying efficiency of the industry's erasure. In the corporate music world, if you are not actively generating revenue on a balance sheet, your existence is systematically scrubbed from the official narrative. As the OJs skyrocketed to international superstardom in the 1970s, the public relations machine worked overtime to craft a pristine, streamlined history of the group. They were marketed as a cohesive trio. The liner notes, the magazine profiles, the television introductions, none of them spared a single paragraph or a passing breath for the man who played guitar in their formative years. The corporate narrative simply closed the gap where Frank Little used to stand, whitening him out of their history with the stroke of a publicist's pen. The sheer mathematical contrast is what makes this erasure so difficult to digest. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the recording labels backing the OJs spent millions of dollars on marketing campaigns, promotional tours, and elaborate stage setups. They hired private investigators to track down copyright infringers. They employed armies of lawyers to protect their publishing assets. Yet, they did not spend a single dollar or allocate a single minute of their vast RCs to inquire about the whereabouts of their founding member. Frank Little was entirely erased from the corporate memory. The machine will track every penny of a recoupment debt, but it will not look for a missing man if his absence does not affect the profit margins. For 40 years, Frank Little existed only as a John Doe in the sterile confines of a forensic laboratory. 4 decades is a staggering amount of time to be separated from your own name. Generations of music fans were born, grew up, and grew old, listening to the foundational sound he helped create, while his physical remains sat on a cold metal shelf, labeled merely with a case number. He was denied the fundamental human right of a dignified burial. He was denied the right to have his family know his fate. The industry that profited from his early labor moved on, glittering and triumphant, while his bones gathered dust. This prolonged anonymity is not just a failure of the local police department. It is an indictment of an entire cultural ecosystem that treats human beings as disposable raw materials. In the context of a man who once stood on stages, who poured his emotions into a microphone, who sought to communicate with the world through the strings of his guitar, becoming a silent, unrecognized skeleton is the absolute antithesis of his life's ambition. He wanted to be heard. The universe, aided by the apathy of the music industry, rendered him entirely mute. The gap between his artistic intentions and his grim physical reality is a canyon of tragedy. It forces us to ask deeply uncomfortable questions about what we truly value when we consume entertainment. Do we love the artist, or do we only love the product the artist provides? The answer arrived incredibly late in the winter of 2021. The silence was finally broken, not by a record executive suddenly growing a conscience, nor by a lavishly funded Hollywood investigation, but by the meticulous, quiet work of the DNA Doe Project. Through painstaking application of genetic genealogy, researchers began to piece together the fractured code of the Twinsburg remains. They mapped the DNA, traced the familial lines through the complex web of ancestry, and finally provided a name to the local authorities. The police then tracked down a close living relative, securing a definitive genetic match. Nearly 40 years after his violent death and anonymous disposal, the John Doe was officially recognized as Frankie Little Jr. The restoration of his name was a profound act of scientific justice, but it also served as a devastating mirror held up to the face of the music industry. The headlines that briefly flashed across news networks in late 2021 carried a heavy realization. The system that built an empire on his foundational sound had simply moved on, leaving him behind without a second thought. The sudden juxtaposition of his grim fate with the enduring polished legacy of his former bandmates highlighted the grotesque disparity in how the machine values human life. You are only remembered as long as your voice can be monetized. Once the microphone is unplugged, your legacy is left entirely to the mercy of strangers in a forensic lab. Frank Little's story forces us to look past the gold records and the induction ceremonies. It demands that we acknowledge the human collateral damage left in the wake of commercial success. He was the physical manifestation of the industry's ultimate power, the power to delete a person. They did not pull the knife that ended his life, but they authored the silence that buried him for a second time. The PR teams and executives who carefully curated the history of Philadelphia soul ensured that his contributions were overshadowed, ignoring the gritty reality of his existence to maintain the pristine illusion of their product. This was not an accidental oversight. It was a deliberate corporate strategy of historical airbrushing. When we listen to the early tracks, when we hear the raw foundational guitar riffs that preceded the massive orchestral arrangements, we are no longer just listening to the evolution of a genre. We are listening to the ghost of a man who was deemed unnecessary by the very system he helped build. We are listening to a man who was cast out into the cold, murdered in the dark, and actively forgotten by the people who inherited his musical real estate. The discovery of his identity does not erase the 40 years of profound disrespect he endured. It merely transitions his story from an anonymous tragedy to a documented historical crime of neglect. The executives sitting in their corner offices, counting the mechanical royalties generated by the group's extensive catalog, never had to look at the crime scene photos. They never had to smell the rot of the garbage bag. They maintained a safe, sterile distance from the physical ruin of the men they employed. Frank Little was the first casualty of this systemic detachment, the first piece of the original machinery to be discarded and destroyed. But the ravenous hunger of the recoupment system and the relentless pressure of the crossover market could not be satisfied with just one erased history. The machine was still running, the debts were still accumulating, and the men who remained standing under the stage lights were about to discover that surviving the cut was not a blessing, but a prolonged, excruciating sentence. The physical destruction of the founding generation had only just begun. The grim reality of Frank Little's fate serves as the perfect, terrifying overture for the horrors that were yet to unfold within the active ranks of the group. If the industry was capable of abandoning a founding member to a frozen ravine, one must consider the psychological environment it created for the members who stayed. The remaining artists were fully aware of the stakes. They saw the speed with which the machine moved on from those who fell behind. This knowledge acted as an invisible, suffocating collar. It dictated their every move, their every complaint, and their every physical limitation. They knew that their value was entirely conditional, tethered strictly to their ability to produce perfect harmonies and flawless choreography on demand. The public was entirely oblivious to this dynamic. The audience saw a united front, a group of men who seemed to have conquered the world. They bought the records to escape their own difficult realities, trusting that the men singing the songs were living the dream they projected. But the artists were living in a state of constant low-grade terror. They were indentured servants, tasked with manufacturing joy. The pressure to maintain the illusion of success while secretly drowning in recoupment debt created an environment of extreme psychological distress. Every sold-out show was just another installment payment to the label. Every television appearance was a desperate bid to remain relevant enough to not be discarded like their former bandmate. The story of Frank Little is not merely a true crime footnote in the biography of a famous band. It is the defining evidence of the industry's absolute lack of humanity. It shatters the myth of the musical family. The label was not a family, it was a factory. And in this factory, human beings were raw materials. If the material was deemed unsuitable for the current production line, it was thrown out. The fact that this particular piece of raw material ended up murdered and forgotten is treated by the corporate history as an unfortunate, unrelated anomaly, rather than the logical endpoint of a system that views artists as disposable objects. The industry had erased Frank Little's existence long before he took his last breath. As the calendar turned from the 1960s into the 1970s, the financial machinery of the Philadelphia soul empire shifted into maximum overdrive. The hits became bigger, the tours became longer, and the corporate demands became increasingly impossible to fulfill. The executives needed more product to feed the recoupment ledgers. They needed more tours to justify the massive promotional budgets. The machine was accelerating to a breakneck speed, and the men trapped inside it were running out of breath. The industry had already demonstrated that it would not look for you if you disappeared. Soon it would demonstrate that it would not let you stop, even if your body was tearing itself apart from the inside out. The physical toll was no longer a matter of exhaustion. It was rapidly becoming a matter of life and death. The stage was set for the next phase of the tragedy, where the violence would not be delivered by a knife in the dark, but by the relentless, grinding pressure of the tour schedule itself. The physical toll of this corporate machine did not start under the stage lights. It began in the shadows backstage. In 1976, stark, unforgiving fluorescent lights cut through the haze of hairspray and stale cigarette smoke inside a suffocating dressing room. William Powell, a foundational pillar of the group's harmonic structure, sits slumped in a folding chair. He is dripping with a cold, unnatural sweat. A makeup artist frantically applies thick layers of foundation to his face, desperately trying to paint the illusion of vitality over skin that has turned a sickly, translucent gray. His tailored sequined suit, the armor of the Philadelphia soul aesthetic, hangs loosely on a frame that is rapidly wasting away. The stage manager knocks violently on the door. The crowd of 10,000 people is roaring, demanding the euphoric experience they paid for. Powell forces himself upright, fighting through waves of nauseating pain, and steps out into the blinding glare of the spotlights. The audience sees an emperor of soul. The reality is a man being eaten alive from the inside out, forced to sing by a ledger of corporate debt that refuses to grant him a sick day. This is where the financial violence of the recoupment system metastasized into physical destruction. The group had achieved astronomical chart success, yet the mechanics of their contracts dictated that they were still perpetually in debt to the label for promotional and production costs. To keep the executives satisfied and to maintain their fragile grip on their commercial standing, they were chained to a grueling, relentless tour schedule. There was no off-season. There was no allowance for human frailty. When William Powell's body finally began to buckle under the strain of this unnatural existence, the industry did not view it as a medical emergency. They viewed it as a logistical inconvenience. Powell was diagnosed with colon cancer. He was only in his mid-30s, an age when most men are just beginning to consolidate their life's work. In any conventional profession, a terminal cancer diagnosis warrants immediate cessation of labor, medical intervention, and palliative care. In the 1970s recording industry, a cancer diagnosis merely meant the label had a depreciating asset on its hands, and they needed to squeeze every last drop of revenue out of it before it completely expired. The tour dates were not canceled. The promotional appearances were not scaled back. By 1975, the physical toll became impossible to hide. Powell's body buckled under the cancer, forcing him off the tour bus and away from the stage. In any conventional profession, a terminal diagnosis warrants a pause, a moment of human grace. But the recoupment debt didn't take sick days. Powell was forced into early retirement to fight for his life, while the industry simply looked at their depreciating asset and began preparing the disposal mechanisms. In May 1977, at just 35 years old, William Powell passed away. But the true blood-chilling nature of the music industry was revealed not in the tragedy of his death, but in the terrifying speed of his replacement. One might expect a period of mourning, a temporary halt to the machinery to honor a founding member whose voice was permanently etched into millions of vinyl records. The corporate reality was radically different. Before the dirt had settled on Powell's grave, the label executives had already executed a contingency plan. The tour could not stop. The recoupment debt still required servicing. Sammy Strain, a highly talented vocalist formerly of Little Anthony and the Imperials, was immediately drafted into the lineup. He was handed the sequined suits, taught the choreography, and pushed onto the stage. William Powell's grave was barely filled before the label executed its contingency plan. The tour didn't stop. The debt didn't pause. Sammy Strain was drafted, handed Powell's sequined suit, and pushed onto the stage. The machine simply swapped a broken gear and kept the music playing. This ruthless substitution sent a psychological shock wave through the remaining original members, fundamentally altering their perception of their own existence. Eddie Levert and Walter Williams had already witnessed the industry erase Frank Little from history, leaving him to rot in anonymity. Now they had watched William Powell be worked to death and instantly replaced as if his 35 years on earth were merely a prelude to a casting change. They were standing on the absolute pinnacle of the music world, yet they had never been more acutely aware of their own complete lack of value as human beings. For Walter Williams, this realization birthed a paralyzing lifelong terror. His fatal weakness, his hamartia, crystallized in the aftermath of Powell's replacement. It was an absolute, all-consuming fear of obsolescence. He understood that in the eyes of the gatekeepers, an artist is only as good as their ability to physically execute the demands of the brand. Weakness, illness, or fatigue were not met with support. They were met with immediate termination. This fear became the invisible prison in which Williams would spend the next 3 decades of his life. In 1983, he prison door slammed shut. Williams began to experience terrifying physical symptoms. His balance wavered. An inexplicable creeping numbness invaded his extremities. A profound, debilitating fatigue settled into his bones, unlike anything he had experienced from standard touring exhaustion. Medical specialists delivered a devastating verdict: multiple sclerosis. It is a chronic, unpredictable, and often disabling autoimmune disease that attacks the central nervous system, disrupting the flow of information within the brain and between the brain and the body. For a man whose entire livelihood depended on precise physical coordination, sustained vocal power, and the projection of boundless energy, an MS diagnosis was the equivalent of a professional death sentence. If he disclosed his condition to the label executives, the outcome was entirely predictable. He had seen the blueprint. They would not offer a reduced schedule or accommodate his medical needs. They would determine that he was a liability, a broken gear that threatened the efficiency of the machine. He would be quietly removed, erased from the promotional materials, and replaced with a healthier, more compliant component, just as they had done to Powell. Faced with the prospect of losing his career, his identity, and his only means of survival, Williams made a harrowing, desperate calculation. He decided to hide the disease. For nearly 30 years, Walter Williams lived a double life of unimaginable psychological and physical torment. He waged a silent, solitary war against his own deteriorating nervous system while maintaining the flawless, smiling facade of a global superstar. The physical reality of executing the Philadelphia soul aesthetic while battling untreated or secretly treated multiple sclerosis is a feat of agonizing endurance. The choreography demanded sharp, synchronized movements, sudden spins, and deep dips. Williams had to perform these complex maneuvers under blinding, heat-radiating stage lights while his brain struggled to communicate with his legs. There were nights when he could not feel his feet touching the stage floor. There were moments when excruciating, burning nerve pain shot through his limbs mid-verse. Yet, he could never break character. He could never grimace, stumble, or ask for a chair. He had to hit his marks perfectly, harmonizing with Levert, projecting an aura of effortless joy to the thousands of screaming fans in the dark. The psychological toll of this deception is difficult to overstate. Every interaction with management, every sound check, every long flight became an exercise in extreme paranoia. Williams lived in constant fear of being discovered. He hid his medications. He endured the physical flare-ups in the solitary confinement of hotel bathrooms, terrified that a crew member or an executive might notice a tremor in his hand or a slight drag in his step. He could not seek the comfort or understanding of his peers in the industry because in that environment, vulnerability was blood in the water. He was entirely alone, trapped inside a failing body, held hostage by a corporate system that demanded physical perfection in exchange for the right to earn a living. This is the ultimate heartbreaking contradiction of the gatekeeping era. The audience looked at Walter Williams and saw the embodiment of success and vitality. They listened to his voice and felt their own burdens lift. They danced to the rhythm of his pain. Meanwhile, the man providing this mass catharsis was locked in a daily battle for basic physiological functioning, driven by the sheer terror of being discarded. He was wealthy in chart statistics, but utterly impoverished in bodily autonomy. The machine had forced him to view his own flesh and blood as an enemy that had to be suppressed and hidden to protect the bottom line. The industry's mandate was clear. You are allowed to be a star, but you are not allowed to be human. The artists were required to absorb all the collateral damage of their fame internally, presenting only a sanitized, indestructible product to the consumer. Williams did not survive the grueling decades of touring because the system supported him. He survived in spite of the system, fueled by the sheer desperate willpower to outrun the replacement gears that were always waiting in the wings. The recording industry does not retire its machinery. It simply passes the operational debt down the bloodline. As the 1980s bled into the 1990s, the founding fathers of Philadelphia soul had been thoroughly ravaged by the system. Frank Little was a forgotten skeleton buried in police archives. William Powell had been worked to death and instantly replaced. Walter Williams was quietly suffocating under the immense psychological weight of hiding a degenerative neurological disease from his employers. Eddie Levert, the powerhouse lead vocalist, had somehow survived the physical and financial meat grinder of the gatekeeping era. But survival in this business is a relative term. The machine had extracted millions of dollars from his vocal cords, and as he aged, the industry began to look for fresh collateral. They did not have to look far. The legacy of the OJs had produced a second generation, born directly into the shadow of the spotlight. The machine shifted its ravenous gaze from the fathers who had been bled dry and locked its sights entirely upon the sons. The cycle of exploitation was about to reinvent itself, trading the physical exhaustion of the stage for the chemical dependency of the modern entertainment era. Gerald and Sean Levert did not just inherit their father's flawless vocal pitch, they inherited the crushing, unyielding pressure of an industry that demands perpetual relevance. Together they formed the platinum-selling R&B group, Levert. On the surface, it appeared to be a triumphant continuation of a royal musical dynasty. They dominated the charts with smooth, powerful anthems like Cassano Va, projecting an image of romantic invincibility and immense wealth. But beneath the velvet exterior of the 1990s and 2000s R&B scene, the mechanics of exploitation had simply evolved into something far more insidious. The physical toll was no longer managed by just smiling through the pain and hiding in dressing rooms. It was managed by the pharmaceutical industry. The crossover pressure of their father's generation had morphed into a demand for constant, superhuman output. An artist was no longer just a singer. They were a multifaceted brand requiring endless tours, studio sessions, television appearances, and corporate partnerships. The human body is simply not designed to sustain that level of elevated cortisol and physical strain without breaking down. Gerald Levert was a monolithic talent, a man whose voice could shake the rafters of any arena. But the fatal weakness of the second generation was the impossible psychological burden of carrying the family crown. Gerald was driven by an obsessive need to maintain the empire his father had built, terrified of slipping backward into the financial insecurity that always loomed over black artists, regardless of their chart history. When the physical degradation began, when the joints ached from decades of choreography, when the vocal cords frayed from overuse, when the sheer anxiety of maintaining a multi-million-dollar corporate apparatus became paralyzing, the modern industry did not offer a hiatus. It offered a chemical scaffold. To keep the artists walking, the doctors prescribed powerful painkillers. To keep them sleeping, they prescribed potent anti-anxiety medications. The artists were handed the chemical tools to forcibly override their own biological warning systems. This was not a narrative of reckless, recreational excess. This was occupational maintenance. Gerald Levert was caught in a pharmaceutical trap entirely facilitated by the demands of his profession. He was using prescription medications to build a bridge across an impossible schedule, and in November 2006, that bridge violently collapsed. At the age of 40, Gerald died in his sleep from an accidental overdose. Toxicology reports revealed a lethal combination of prescription narcotic pain relievers and anti-anxiety medication. It was a quiet, domestic tragedy that masked a brutal industrial reality. The machine had pushed him to the absolute edge of human endurance, provided him with the chemicals required to keep producing revenue, and then looked away when his heart finally stopped beating. The industry mourned publicly, releasing statements of profound loss, but the ledgers remained open. Eddie Levert, a man who had spent his life singing about global healing, was forced to stand in a cemetery and bury the son who was supposed to carry his musical torch into the future. The death of Gerald Levert should have been a devastating wake-up call, a moment for the entire entertainment ecosystem to halt and reevaluate the human cost of its operations. Instead, the tragedy merely served as a prelude to a far more sinister systemic failure. If Gerald's death was an industrial accident, the fate of his younger brother, Sean Levert, was nothing short of a bureaucratic execution. The tragedy of the Levert family proves that when the entertainment industry finishes stripping an artist of their autonomy, the state is perfectly willing to step in and finish the job. By 2008, Sean Levert was grappling with the profound grief of losing his brother, the fading momentum of his musical career, and the complicated, often illusory financial reality of being R&B royalty. The public assumes that artists with platinum records possess infinite wealth. The reality of the recoupment system and decades of predatory contracts meant that many artists lived check to check, their perceived wealth locked in assets they did not actually own. Sean fell behind on his child support payments, accumulating an $80,000 debt. For a man whose Millie name was synonymous with global success, it was a humiliating public contradiction. The legal system did not view him as a grieving brother or a cultural icon. It viewed him as a delinquent debtor. In March 2008, Sean Levert was sentenced to 22 months in the Cuyahoga County Jail in Ohio. When a human being is processed into a county correctional facility, they are entirely at the mercy of the institutional medical staff. Sean Levert entered the jail with a documented, legally prescribed dependence on Xanax, a powerful benzodiazepine used to manage severe anxiety and panic disorders. Conditions undoubtedly exacerbated by a lifetime spent inside the pressure cooker of the music business. The physiological reality of benzodiazepine dependence is absolute. It is not a psychological preference. It is a chemical baseline. If the medication is abruptly withdrawn, the central nervous system goes into a state of catastrophic shock, rebound anxiety, severe tremors, terrifying hallucinations, and fatal seizures are the documented, predictable outcomes of forced withdrawal. The medical protocol for managing this is universally understood. A patient must be slowly and carefully tapered off the drug under strict clinical supervision. The Cuyahoga County Jail, however, operated under a policy of chilling institutional indifference. The medical staff at the facility coldly refused to administer Sean's prescribed medication. They did not initiate a taper. They completely severed his access to the chemical stabilizer his brain required to function. The justice system, functioning with the exact same lack of empathy as the record labels, decided that his medical needs were a logistical inconvenience. Over the course of a few agonizing days, Sean Levert descended into a neurological hell. The withdrawals set in violently. He began to experience severe psychosis, pacing his cell, hallucinating and screaming in terror as his brain misfired uncontrollably. This is where the I call horror of the story reaches its absolute peak. The guards and the medical staff did not look at Sean Levert and see a patient experiencing a life-threatening chemically induced medical emergency. They saw a behavioral compliance issue. They criminalized his medical crisis. Instead of transporting him to a hospital, instead of administering the medication that would have instantly stabilized his nervous system, the authorities deployed physical force. An R&B prince, a man whose voice had contributed to the soundtrack of millions of lives, was dragged out of his cell and violently strapped into a restraint chair. The indignity of this visual is sheer and devastating. Leather straps pulled tight across his chest, his arms pinned down, his legs immobilized in a cold, peeling room illuminated by harsh institutional lighting. He was trapped in a state of absolute hallucinatory panic, his body screaming for a medication he was legally entitled to have, while the state ignored his suffering. They left him strapped in that chair, watching him unravel, treating his agonizing medical emergency as a disciplinary infraction. The human heart can only endure a finite amount of sheer, unmitigated terror before the biological engine simply gives up. Sean Levert's heart stopped. He died on that restraint chair, choked to death by the bureaucratic apathy of a system that was ostensibly designed to hold him safely. The contrast between the life he was meant to live and the way he died is a trauma that defies articulation. He was a man who sang about love, suffocated in a room completely devoid of it. The coroner's report later confirmed that his death was the direct result of complications from benzodiazepine withdrawal, compounded by the physical restraint. The system that was meant to rehabilitate him became his executioner. In the aftermath of this atrocity, the Levert family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Cuyahoga County. The legal proceedings dragged the ugly-neagly gent practices of the jail's medical contractor into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Eventually, the family was awarded a $4 million settlement. But we must be exceptionally clear about what this money represents. A $4 million settlement is not justice. It is hush money paid by the state to balance a ledger of liability. It cannot buy back the breath of a son. It cannot erase the memory of the restraint chair. It is simply a mathematical transaction for a lost human life, echoing the very recoupment ledgers that started this entire generational curse decades earlier. Eddie Levert, the patriarch who had survived the golden era of soul, was left standing alone, having buried 2 sons in the span of 24 months. The industry took his money, it took his publishing rights, and ultimately, through its relentless pressure and systemic complicity, it took his bloodline. The totality of this historical narrative demands a complete reevaluation of the Philadelphia soul legacy. For decades, the corporate machine successfully marketed a sanitized illusion, selling anthems of peace and universal brotherhood, while actively concealing the human cost of their production. The gold records and Hall of Fame inductions serve as a glittering facade, obscuring a systemic mechanism of exploitation that spanned 3 distinct generations. This was not a localized failure or a series of unfortunate accidents. It was a highly efficient predatory business model that viewed human life as a depreciating asset. The true legacy of these artists is not simply the flawless harmonies they left behind, but the staggering physical and psychological endurance required to produce them. William Powell was pushed past the limits of human biology on stage to service a manufactured recoupment debt. Walter Williams spent 30 years hiding a debilitating neurological disease in the dark, paralyzed by the industry's proven willingness to discard broken components. Frank Little, the foundational architect of their sound, was erased from corporate memory and left as a John Doe for 4 decades. And ultimately, Gerald and Sean Levert collapsed under the inherited weight of this exact same machine, chemically bound to a system that demanded constant output and fatally neglected by a state apparatus that criminalized a medical crisis. When we listen to these tracks today, the context must fundamentally shift. These artists provided emotional salvation to millions while being systematically denied their own bodily autonomy, financial equity, and basic human dignity. Acknowledging this brutal reality does not diminish their musical achievements. It establishes the absolute truth of their survival. They earned their permanent place in history by producing transcendent art from within an industrial apparatus designed to consume them. The ledgers are finally exposed, the corporate veneer is stripped away, and their history stands corrected.